Recording in progress.
We're going to look at how you use a quote inside a paragraph. How do you answer a question and use a quote to support what you're saying? This is just kind of further teaching about that CQE paragraph where you make a claim, you support it with a quote, and then you give an explanation. And I will this week link back those PowerPoint slides about CQE if you need a refresher of that. But I asked you last week, I'm going to ask you this week to write a paragraph about a question that I give you. And last week the question was, what makes a good king? And I asked you to identify an answer to that, right? So you would first make a claim. For example, I'll just put one right here. A good king is strong and ready to defend his people. Notice, I don't think I have a pointer arrow here, but it shows up for me. I'm not sure if it'll show up for you. Okay. Notice I'm using the words from the question. What makes a good king? A good king, and then I'm going to answer it, is strong and ready to defend his people. That would be my claim. But I want to support that with a quote from the book. And so it might be helpful for you to have your book handy so you can turn. I've identified a quote that supports this claim, that a good king is strong and ready to defend his people. And I found it in chapter 21. If you want to scroll and look at it with me, you certainly can. Scroll through your book, 21, and it's on page 76. No, it's not. It's on page 64. That's a mess up there. Forgive me for that. In my book, it's on page 64. It's still in chapter 21, though. I don't know why I put that. Anyway, and since this is poetry, you scroll all the way down to the bottom till you find the lines 1471 and 1472. Note that the lines are marked just in 5 increments. So the numbers go from like 1445 to 1450 to 1455, etc. So in order to find this specific quote, you just look at the line numbers. I find 1470, and I would need to count down to 1471, 1472. And this is an awesome quote. It says, Beowulf and fear were strangers. Man, that's pretty cool, right? He is a hero. He stood ready to dive into battle. So this quote totally matches my claim that a good king is ready to defend his people. And I want to put this in my writing, but how do I do that? What does that look like? And let's just take a minute to break this down. It's so important that you learn this because to support your work is going to be critical from this point onward. We wrote some fairly simple essays, but we're going to start to use evidence from a book to support the things that we're saying. And so as you write your CQE paragraphs this week, you're going to want to find a quote from the book that supports what you're saying. Let's take a look here at the first thing you do. The first thing you want to do after you find your quote, right? You kind of dig through your reading and look for something that supports what you're saying. You want to use a signal phrase. Now, a signal phrase is like a stoplight. A stoplight for a driver says "I can go," or maybe a street sign that says "Turn here. This is the street." A signal tells you something, and using a signal phrase for a quote tells your reader, "I'm going to quote from the book," without saying "I'm going to quote from the book," because that would just sound a little probably, I don't know, basic. So you want to use a signal phrase, and in this situation, for my example, I am going to mention the author. Now, we don't know the author of Beowulf. He's an anonymous poet. We have no idea. I know the translator is Burton Raffel, but there's lots of translators. There's Seamus Heaney. J.R. Tolkien did a translation of Beowulf. This particular one is Raffel. However, I think I want to refer to the guy who wrote the poem, and he is referred to as the Beowulf poet. That's how we can identify him. So I'm going to use the Beowulf poet. So what would that look like for a signal phrase? It would look like, I don't know why that slide advanced. The Beowulf poet writes, comma, Beowulf and Fear were strangers. He stood ready to dive into battle. Now you see some other stuff there. We're going to get to that in a second. So don't worry about it. Just look at the quote. Don't worry about that big slash line or why I put Raphael 1471 at the end. Don't worry about that yet. Okay? Signal phrase. You want to use a signal phrase. Now, in your writing handbook, there is a whole section on how to put a quote in your writing. It's kind of smack dab in the middle of your writing handbook. And it's going to tell you that using a signal phrase is one of the ways that you can include a quote. And it's a great way to include a quote. There are other ways to do it as well, but this is a signal phrase is pretty standard. And it's important that you do that. Otherwise, your reader doesn't quite know. It just feels clunky. If I were to just say, a good king is ready to defend his people, and then jumped right into the quote. So I need to use a signal phrase that connects my quote to my claim, just like a bridge. Okay, so make sure when you're writing your paragraphs that you're using a signal phrase before your quote. The next thing you want to do in order to put this quote into your writing is you want to follow the rules of poetry. This is a poem. It doesn't look like a novel. It's not going to read like a short story in the way that The Ransom of Red Chief was set up. So in The Ransom of Red Chief or any other short story you've read, the sentences are what drive the structure. And so a sentence will go all the way to the end. And if we run out of room, then we move to the second line. Poetry doesn't work that way. Poetry works on lines. Whereas like a story, like if you're to read The Hobbit or you're to read, any novel that you want to read, if it's not poetry, the lines are going to look a lot different. And you can just visually see, I took a picture of one of my pages here, page 64. You can see visually something's different. Look at the end of the lines. Take a look at how the spacing looks, right? It's not justified. It's kind of jagged, and the lines of poetry look different than regular sentences. And we also know it's lines of poetry because he's a poet, but we see line numbers indicated on the left-hand side of the page. And so when you use a quote for poetry, it has to look slightly different because we're quoting lines of poetry. So if you look at the bottom, you can look in your book or you can look at the bottom of this page. Look at line 1471. The quote I'm using starts with, it says, but Beowulf and Fear were strangers. I probably should have put the word but before Beowulf. Sorry about that. That's a little bit of a typo. If you don't, you can use an ellipsis. We'll talk about that later. But let's just pretend, I can't fix it here now, but that I put the word but Beowulf and Fear. That is on line 1471. And then the line ends and a new line starts. Can you see that visually as you look at 1472? Okay, so we have Beowulf and Fear. The line ends, so I'm going to use a line break. It's like a slash. You can see that. That tells the reader this line of poetry ended and a new line of poetry is starting. That's what a line break is for. So I'll get to the end of one line. Every time you get to the end of a line in poetry and you're typing it and you're using it as a quote, you have to use what's called the line break. And that's what's highlighted right there. Beowulf and Fear, space, line break, space. Now my next line, 1472, starts with were strangers. Now the thought goes together. Beowulf and Fear were strangers. But the lines don't go together. So I have to have that line break. In poetry, that you can just look all the way up on the left-hand side. Those first words in a poem, in the line, are capitalized. It's poetry. So I will capitalize the word were because it's capitalized in the book. Were strangers. He stood ready to dive into battle. So that's one of the rules for poetry is that you use line breaks at the end of a line, and the next line is probably capitalized, and so you will capitalize it. Especially just follow what the book is doing. Does that make sense? That we're following the rules of poetry when we type the words of poetry. Seems to make sense, right? Okay. If you get, whoops, hold on. If you get confused by this, you can always look back and see the setup there. Okay, the next thing I need to do when I'm putting this quote in my writing is I have to use something called in-text citation. And that's just a fancy way to talk about how we give the source. How do we give the source? And so when I'm including a quote in my writing, at the end of the quote, I'm going to include special information. Now that special information can change. If it is, well, there's different rules. And as you're with me in Great Books 1 and Great Books 2, we'll talk about different rules, but I'll start you off really simple. Say I'm writing a great big essay on Beowulf, and the first time I use a quote from Beowulf is this quote I'm going to use to support this idea that good leaders are ready to defend their people. This is the first quote I'm using. So in parentheses after the quote, so you see those little parentheses there, you usually include the author, and it could be a page number if it's a regular book. This is not a regular book, it's a poem. So instead of a page number, I'm just going to use the line numbers. And we use special rules that are called MLA rules. And you don't need to know too much about that right now. You'll be hearing that for many years to come if you're with me in Great Books 1, Great Books 2, and any other classes at FA. In this situation, I don't have an author. Beowulf is written by an anonymous poet. And so I'm going to pick the translator. So I'm going to put his last name, Raphael. And you can see the spelling right there in the front of your cover, Raphael. And then all I need to include are the specific line numbers for this quote. Now, if you remember, when I first looked for a quote, I found it in chapter 21. I found it on page 76. It's from the book Beowulf. I don't need to include all that information. All I need to include are the line numbers. I don't have to put the word line numbers in there. I just put the line numbers. In MLA, we keep it as simple as possible. If there are other rules for other kinds of writers, so say you're writing a science paper and they use something called APA, it's slightly different, then they have different rules. But everybody in English class, everybody in history class, everybody in a philosophy class, whether it's high school or college, probably uses these rules called MLA rules. And so at the end of your quote, you're going to put Raphael and the line numbers. Now, this can change. Let me tell you how it changes. If you're writing a great big essay and you used 2 quotes, only the first quote needs the author's last name, or in this case, the translator's last name, because as long as you're writing about that book, me, the reader, I already know that you're talking about this book. Does that make sense? And that's when I'll remind you of often that you only need to use that last name the first time you use a quote. Say we travel in our time machine to after having read Macbeth. Macbeth's author is Shakespeare. And so when you go to write an essay and you use a quote from Shakespeare, you're going to put Shakespeare, and then you'll cite where the specific quote is from. Okay, before I move on to the next slide, let's also just take a look at the punctuation for a second here. Notice that the end of the sentence, there's a period at battle, right? Battle, period. Beowulf in fear with strangers, he's ready to dive into battle. Let me see if I can get to the page number. Right? Like as a sentence, it ends with a period. However, when you use in-text citation, that information comes before the end of the sentence. And so this period that should go here, the word end of battle, is going to slide all the way to the end of your in-text citation. That's going to end your sentence. And you kind of get that clue with a name, in text, right? It's inside the text. It's going right there into your writing. There are other rules for that too, like if it were to end with an exclamation point or question mark. We'll get to that later, but for now, that's kind of the general rule, is the end punctuation is going to show up right there after the in-text citation. And it helps to just see it. So if you have to see it again, take a look at your writing handbook. There's lots of examples for in-text citation. Okay, so let's say you need to see a picture of what this looks like in the whole paragraph. So my whole paragraph is going to have a claim, it's going to have a quote, and it's going to have an explanation. So my claim is that a good king is strong and ready to defend his people. I found a quote to support that in Beowulf in chapter 21, and I'm going to use a signal phrase. The Beowulf poet writes, Beowulf in fear were strangers. He stood ready to dive into battle. And then I'm going to use my in-text citation, and you can see it right there. And then to end a paragraph, I want to offer an explanation. And the explanation is usually the biggest part of the paragraph. Note, my claim is like one sentence. My quote is one sentence. My explanation is bigger, isn't it? So in my explanation, I say, since Beowulf knew no fear, his unflinching courage caused him to defend others. He was the first to volunteer to fight Grendel and the only man who could save the Danes from Grendel's mother. His readiness to fight against evil marks him as a hero. That's my explanation. Now, you're not going to write your paragraph with these words, claim, quote, and explanation. So it's going to look like this. Although, if I were to do this again, I would indent that first line because that's what you're supposed to do with the paragraph. Clearly, that needs to be fixed. A good king is strong and ready to defend his people. The Beowulf poet writes, and there's my quote, and then there's my explanation, and that makes an entire paragraph. Do you see how you can use those three parts to work together to answer a question? This is a great way to answer any question for any class that you have. Answer the question, give some support for it, and then explain it. And if you're using a quote, you want to do in-text citation. And for Beowulf, this is poetry, and so you're going to set it up by following the poetry rules. That's the end. All right, if you have any questions, please shoot them my way. I'd be happy to answer you. And again, writing is a journey, and you're going to learn these rules, and then you're going to learn them again, and then you're going to learn them again, and you have your writing handbook to help you. You can check this. You can look at the structure, look at the setup. And when you write essays, I'll probably say, hey, make sure you get this punctuation here at the end. I'll give you lots of feedback. So you'll figure it out. However, now that I've showed you how to use in-text citation and use signal phrases and use the rules for poetry, you are accountable for this information. So as you write your next paragraph for me and I say use a CQE, or as you write your essay and I say use at least one quote from Beowulf, these rules need to show up in your writing. All right, God bless and have a good rest of your week.